I'm Hank, and my story is the lottery. All the boys and girls were running around the town square. They were wearing their nice Sunday clothes, the girls with their petty skirts, and the boys with their button-down shirts. And the boys were throwing rocks at each other, and the little kids had just recently gotten out of school, so they were still talking about school, their school teachers, their lunches, recess, classes they liked, teachers they didn't like, things of that nature. The mothers followed behind them, wearing their nice Sunday clothes as well, and they were talking about how nice it was to have all the kids home again for the summer. They would change their minds soon enough, but for now it was nice. So all the little girls stood and played, and all the little boys gathered stones and they chucked them at each other in a little boy fashion, something so brutal but still harmless since they were children. They gathered little rock piles and they protected them from the other boys, and they played their little games. When their mothers began to call them, of course, they didn't want to listen. They had to be called 4 or 5 times, and finally by that point, their fathers had begun to call them as well, so of course they came running. All the families stood together in one big, rudimentary semicircle in the town square, wearing their best Sunday clothes, because today was a special day. Today was June 27th. June 27th doesn't seem like a special day to just about anyone else, but here in this rural town in 1952, June 27th was a very special day. On this day, this town and all of the neighboring towns performed a ceremony of sorts that they and all the other villages had begun since before the town was settled, that the settlers had brought from their native land to these towns when they settled. It was something that had a lot of myth surrounding it. A lot of people thought something had used to happen, but there was nothing written down about this special day. So everything traveled by word of mouth, and lots of different things were forgotten over the years or misinterpreted as well. Today was called the lottery. Now, the winner of the lottery would never be the same afterwards, and their families' lives would be changed forever as well. The lottery was officiated by Joe Summers. Now, Joe Summers was someone that people in the town felt really bad for, because he didn't have children, his wife was a shrew who always complained at him, but he had lots of time for civic activities. So he spent his time hosting baseball, hosting the hoedown, and helping with all of the crops when that time went around. He worked at the coal factory, and he worked up in his tower for long hours into the night. But he had lots of time for all of his civic activities, and he had a big booming voice that matched those activities. He always wore button-down plaid shirts, jeans, and then cowboy boots and a straw hat. Now, Mr. Summers was coming out of his coal office carrying the big black box. One of the things that the town people might know or might not know is if the black box was original. They knew that this black box was not the original one used by the settlers. They tried to keep to tradition as much as possible, but sometimes things fall apart over the years. However, there were rumors that ran around saying that this black box was made out of pieces of the original black box. So every year after the lottery, when Joe Summers talked about building a brand new black box, one out of steel that would withstand hundreds of years, people dug their heels at the idea, and no one would give him a definite yes or no. So every year his talk faded into nothing, and they used the same black box, year after year after year. And at this point, the box was so faded it was barely black. It was really just an ashy look, and it looked like it had been through a bad fire. But the townspeople kept using it because that was their tradition. The oldest man in the town, Old Man Warren, had been using that black box since his first lottery. So at this point, it had become their tradition. Joe Summers was coming out of his coal office, followed by Henry Graves. Now, Mr. Graves was carrying a wooden stool behind Mr. Summers. As Mr. Summers exited his office, he called out to the townspeople, "Running a little late today, folks." So he came out to the center with his big black box. Mr. Graves set down the stool, and he set the box on top of it. He called out to the crowd, "Anybody care to give me a hand?" After a moment's hesitation, Mr. Hellman and his oldest son, Bobby, came forward, held the black box on each side for Mr. Summers, as he reached his hand in and mixed up all of the contents in the box. They had originally used wood chips as the ballots for the lottery, but Joe Summers had succeeded in getting the town to switch over to paper, which he had argued was much easier to keep up with the growing population. They were now a town of 300. Their lottery started at 10 a.m., and it ended just in time for a 12 o'clock dinner. There were other towns nearby that had such big populations that their lottery took them 2 full days, but they were lucky to only have 300. But in Joe Summers' argument, 300 was still enough to make wood chips pretty impractical and heavy. They were hard to fit in that black box. After all of the contents had been stirred up, Mr. Summers thanked the boys when they returned back to their families. He liked to address the crowd. He liked to make the lottery as personal as possible. People used to think that there were kind of like songs that the group had sung. There was an oath that used to be taken by the officiator. All of this, of course, had been lost in time. They didn't follow any of it, but Joe did make a point to talk to every person as they came up to take their ballot from the box. He looked out to the crowd and he said, "Is anybody missing? Are we missing anybody?" The townspeople began to whisper amongst themselves, and he heard a voice rise up from the whisper, "Duncan, Duncan, Duncan, Duncan." And he said, "Well, where's Clyde Duncan? He broke his leg, didn't he? Who's going to be pulling for Mr. Duncan?" So then a quiet voice called out from the back of the crowd, "I guess I will." He said, "All right, wife calling for husband. Don't you have a boy to do it for you?" Now, he and all the townspeople knew that she didn't have a man in the family to pull for her, but it was his job as officiator to ask the questions out loud to clear the air for everyone. So Miss Duncan called out, "No, my boy's but 16. He's not old enough yet." So Mr. Summers marked this on his list. He had spent the entire night before making a list of all the people in the town. He made a list of all of the households, and then made a list of all the heads of the households. The head of the household was going to be the person who pulled for the whole family. There was a lot of list making that went into the lottery, and Mr. Summers took his job very seriously. Next, he looked out and he said, "Is young Wilkins going to be pulling this year? Young boy Wilkins?" A tall, awkward, lanky figure peeped his hand up from the back of the rows, and he said, "Yes, sir, I will be." And Mr. Summers nodded and he said, "I'm glad your mom has a man to do it for her." "All right, is that about everybody? Are we ready to get started?" And just then, people heard shuffling and running, someone yelling, "Wait, wait!" from behind them. The semicircle turned around, and they saw Mrs. Hutchinson running up, her sweater thrown around her arms and her hair flying back behind her as she rushed up behind them. She came up to her friend and she said, "Delacroix, have they started yet?" And Miss Delacroix said, "No, they've just been up there talking. You're just in time." Spotting her family across the circle, she patted Delacroix on the shoulder and she was like, "Let me get over to my family. I completely forgot what today was. I looked up and I remembered it was the 27th because I thought my old man was in the garden. And I looked up and he was gone. So I grabbed my little boy and I ran as fast as I could." Hoisting Davy up on her hip, she walked over to her family. And addressing her, Mr. Summers said, "I thought we'd have to continue on without you, Tessie." She said, "You wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" There was a slight murmur of laughter from all of her friends and family around her. With that, Mr. Summers said, "All right, we got everyone here. All of our households are accounted for, so I think it's time to get the show on the road so we can done by noon so we can all eat our dinner, okay? Let me list off these rules, and then we can get started." Now, everyone knew the rules. Everyone had been through many lotteries at this point. Youngest kids came with their parents. Teenagers watched their parents because young boys would be taking over for their households when they became 18. So they all knew the rules of the lottery. No one listened when Joe did this, but he had to do it as a formality and just to make sure everyone knew what they were doing. So Joe held up his paper, gave it a good shake in the breeze, and he said, "Now when I call the name of the person in the household, the head of that household is going to come up here, take one paper, one slip of paper only, one slip of paper per household, and you're going to hold onto that paper and not look at it until we all have one. Is everybody clear?" All the heads nodded as if they were on puppet strings. And Joe pulled out his list of all the families and he said, "All right, let's get going. Adams, Belmont, Delacroix, Delacruz." He continued down the line. Mr. Adams walked up first, slowly but surely, having solid footsteps in front of himself, but with his fingers shaking ever so slightly. He walked up to the box and he nodded to Joe Summers, and Mr. Summers nodded back to him and said, "How are you doing today, Mr. Adams?" Mr. Adams said, "Oh, I'm doing fine. Well, how are you, Summers?" He said, "Well, I'm right as rain." So Adams picked his poison very carefully. He pulled out a slip, held it in both hands, and walked back to his wife and his 2 young children. He nodded to Mr. Warren, and he said, "You know, In other towns, they're talking about getting rid of the lottery. Old man Warren just shook his head and he said, "A bunch of young fools. They don't know what's good for them. This has been tradition. Young people don't have any respect for tradition. They want us to go back to living in caves and eating acorns. There's always been a lottery. There used to be a saying, lottery in June, corn will be heavy soon. Lottery is good for the harvest. It's good for the soul. How can they say they don't want to have a lottery?" And Mrs. Adams chimed in and she said, "Well, some towns have already gotten rid of the lottery." And to this, old man Warren just shook his head and he said, "Young fools. They don't know what's good for them." Up front, Joe Summers was still going through his list. As he got down to Hutchinson, and Tessie's husband, Bill, came up to the front, shook hands with Mr. Summers and took his slip, came back to his spot in line. Going down the line, old man Warren's name was called. As he walked to the center of the circle with his cane, he said, "77th lottery. It's my 77th." And there was a light applause from all of his neighbors around him. Finally, they finished the names with Zanini. And with that, Summers looked around, holding his own piece of paper in his hands, Mr. Graves next to him, holding his slip of paper in his hand, and he said, "Has every household gotten a paper? This is very important. Have we all gotten our paper?" Everyone nodded. You could hear the rustling of the papers in the men's large hands. Some held them behind their backs, some held them in two hands, some had shoved them deep into their pockets to keep them from looking at it. Everyone looked around a bit nervously. This was the breaking point. So Joe Summers called, "Okay, everybody look at your slips. We'll see who won this year." All the men pulled out their slips, and suddenly the women were upon them, and they were all yelling, "Who got it? Who got it? Who got it?" in their hushed tones. "Who's got it? Is it Hutchinson? Is it Williams? Is it Warren?" And suddenly the room was quiet as someone said, "Bill's got it. Bill Hutchinson's got it." And Mr. Summers addressed Bill. He said, "Bill, is that true? Did you get the ticket?" Bill held up his ticket for Summers to see, and everyone took in a deep breath because Bill did have the ticket. Tessie jumped out in the center of the circle and she said, "It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair. You saw that. Everyone saw that Joe was rushing him. How can y'all say that that was fair? It clearly wasn't. Joe, do it over again. We need to do it over again because that was not fair." Bill grabbed her arm and pulled her back forcefully, and he said, "Tessie, shut up." Mr. Summers addressed Bill, not Tessie, as he said, "Bill, you got any other heads in your household?" Tessie said, "Well, we've got the two girls, Edna and Marlou." And Bill said, "They're married, Tessie. You know as well as I do that they pull with their husbands' families." And Joe Summers said, "That's correct. They pull with their husbands' families." Tessie shrunk back to her spot next to Bill, looking nervously around, pleading with the people next to her very quietly. "You saw it wasn't fair, right? You saw that that wasn't fair." No one addressed her, paid her any mind. So Bill said, "Well, we've got the three kids. We've got Bill Jr., we've got Norma, and we've got little Davy here, and then Tessie and myself, so we've got 5 people in our household." And Mr. Summers nodded slowly as Mr. Graves collected the papers back from all the men. He put them back into the box, and they collected out 4 of the papers from other people, and then Bill's ballot from him. They put them back into the box and shook them up. Mr. Summers instructed Mr. Graves to help little Davy over, and the whole crowd held their breath as the little boy toddled up to the front, holding Mr. Graves' hand. He was giggling and skipping and taking big, big steps for such a little person, and everyone held their breath, wondering which ticket he would pull. When they got up to the front, Mr. Graves squatted down next to him and said, "Little Davy, I need you to pull 1 ticket. Just 1 ticket, okay? Can you do that for me? Just grab 1. So Davy pulled his little arm into the big box, and he pulled out 1 ticket, and Mr. Summers instructed Graves to hold the ticket. So Graves held the ticket, put it in his pocket, and held little Davy's hand off to the side of the box. Next up came Norma. She was switching her skirt very prettily, and all of her schoolmates whispered, "I hope it isn't her, I hope it isn't her." And old man Warren, hearing this, shouted out into the crowd, "It ain't the same as it used to be. People ain't the same as they used to be. Bunch of fools." And Norma very daintily picked out her ticket and stood next to her brother with it behind her arm, cheerleader fashion. Last up came Bill Jr. Very clumsily, he almost knocked the box off of the pedestal before he pulled out a ticket and held it in his too large hand, crumpled it up, and stood next to his sister and his little brother. Then came Bill, who pulled out a ticket for the second time today. And then last came Tessie, who looked away as she reached a trembling finger in and snatched one out, and then quickly held it behind her back. They all had their tickets. They stood in a line in front of Mr. Summers, waiting to seal their fate. As he looked at all of them, and he said, "You can open them now. Graves, you help little Davy." So Graves unfolded little Davy's paper, and he held it up triumphantly for the whole crowd to see, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief, seeing that the toddler's paper was blank. Next came Norma and little Bill, and they held theirs up triumphantly as well, seeing that they were blank. Bill held his up, and it was also blank. And the crowd was silent. Everyone turned to Tessie, whispering, "It's Tessie Hutchinson. Tessie Hutchinson's won." Mr. Summers addressed Bill as he said, "Bill, show us her slip." Tessie held it clutched behind her hand. She hadn't even opened it. He pried it from her fingers and held up the crumpled paper to reveal a dark circle drawn in graphite in the center that Summers had scribbled in the night before at midnight, sitting at the desk of his coal office. This dark spot showed that Tessie was the winner of this year's lottery. Everyone began to slowly back away from her. Her family backed into the surrounding crowd, and suddenly the whole circle looked like a bullet's eye, with Tessie standing straight in the middle. Now, the villagers had forgotten a lot about the original lottery. They didn't know the hymns. They didn't know the ordained chant. They didn't know the original box. They didn't use the wooden chips anymore. They didn't even know why the lottery was started. But they remembered to use rocks. Tessie pleaded with everyone around her. She said, "No, please, y'all saw that wasn't fair. That wasn't fair. Please, we need to do a redraw. Everyone, that wasn't fair." And people in the crowd, not looking her in the eyes, said, "Tessie, we all took the same chance. Shut up, Tessie, and accept it. We all took the same chance." And suddenly they all had rocks in their hands. Her friend, Miss Delacroix, was holding a rock as big as her head. Somebody handed Davy a little pebble to throw at his own mother. And suddenly they were upon her.